Hello, my name is Michael Yeager. I'm the president of the 12-Step Counselors Association and also of Contemporary Teaching, an international company providing continuing education credit hours to therapists. I've also been in the field of healthcare recovery, particularly in the addiction recovery field, since 1973. I've had the opportunity to design and implement 9 different treatment programs in Texas and in Colorado. And in 1989, I went into private practice, and since '89, I've also facilitated at 2 hospitals, helping them design multi-addiction and dual addiction treatment programs. This talk is on utilizing the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. This text here, we're going with the new edition, the 4th edition, is the textbook for this course. And the reason I picked it is just that it's most readily accessible right now. And what I've noticed over the years is that addiction recovery, at least in that particular field, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous have been, they are basically the primary treatment modality. It's hard to find an addiction treatment program in the United States and in Canada that don't utilize the 12 steps primarily. There are a few that use rational recovery or smart recovery, and in Europe a process called solution-focused therapy is becoming the norm over there and replacing 12-step. This course is about simply talking about using the 12 steps, where they come from, so that staff, whether they are in recovery from an addiction or not, will have better knowledge of the origin of 12-step and can be more therapeutically beneficial to the clients when the client is looking at using the 12-step or it's in conjunction with their treatment program. So I'll be going through the text. I'll be touching briefly on the 12 steps of AA, but those will be are addressed more specifically in another course that's available called The Therapeutic Value of the 12 Steps using the 12 by 12. So this is basically more the history and taking a look at the principles in AA to see how they can be applied. And I'll be reading some things out of the text. I'll also be talking about some of those things that I read, so you'll get both of those perspectives. I'm going to attempt to not impart my my preferences or my beliefs here. I simply want to report the information or the strategies as accurately as I can so that you then can help make up your own mind about how they can work best for you, and in turn, and more importantly, how they can in fact work best for your client. Now I will say this, that AA also states that it does not have a corner on the market, that they've simply found something that works for them. So I want to caution people, as you understand the 12 steps and we go through this, to take this piece of wisdom from the 12 steps into your own practice or into your own program as well. That the 12 steps, although highly beneficial for a variety of people, might not be the strategy that will work most effectively for them. So do keep that in mind as we go through the process, because there's incredible wisdom in this book. And as I've read it and reread it in order to prepare for this course, besides how I've studied it in the past, I was just amazed one more time at the amount of incredible wisdom that is contained here that was put down in the 30s and still continues to be very accurate today. So I want to talk about what they talk about in the very first edition of the Big Book, written in 1939. It says in the very first page there, we want to show alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. So they're making a very bold statement that people have in fact recovered. They got over it. They went beyond their relationship to drugs and alcohol, or alcohol while it was started, and recovered from it. So it's a report of action taken, as I've continued to hear it be said. For them, we choose these pages, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. So what they're attempting to say here, what they are saying here, is that if you do what is said that we did in here, then you will in fact recover too. So that's a pretty strong endorsement of the strength of the steps, and that's how the book starts. So it doesn't talk about slips, it doesn't talk about going back and using again. It talks very specifically that this is exactly how they have recovered. So again, reports of action taken. It goes on to state that it is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals that may result from this publication. So anonymity was created initially because they didn't have a large group of people to handle all the questions that they assumed might come in. So that's a real reason for the anonymity initially, wasn't to protect the people per se, or even the organization, just that they didn't think they could handle the onslaught of people that was going to come through. So as we go through the text, be aware that the book was written long after people had recovered and gotten over their relationship with drugs and alcohol, and this is simply what they did later on down the line, 5 years after it started, in order to take a look at what they did in order to affect recovery. We're going to start with the doctor's opinion. It was basically written by William Silkworth, and what he says is that the body of the alcoholic is as quite abnormal as his mind. It did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted to life, that we were in full flight from reality, or were outright mentally defective. These things were true to some extent, in fact, to a considerable extent with some of us, but we are sure that our bodies were sickened as well. It is our belief any picture of the alcoholic that leaves out the physical factor is incomplete. Again, the value of this particular statement here, that the body is involved, is that from a, let's say, shame reduction standpoint, the value of that idea there from a shame reduction standpoint is that many alcoholics that I know and addicts that come in and they're very ashamed of the things that they did when they were using. Now, if you think about it, that alcohol is a sedative drug, and it puts the brain to sleep. So the judgment, which is one of the parts of the brain that goes to sleep when they're drinking, isn't working. Of course, people are going to compromise their values. They're going to say and do things that they wouldn't normally say or do when they have full control of their faculties. And so that's what it's talking about there. And again, from a shame reduction standpoint, this can be great information to say, you are certainly responsible for the behaviors that you did when you were under the influence, but there was a different part of you. It was the drug driving the behavior, not you, the individual, driving the behavior. And so from that standpoint, it can be explained rather than excused in such a way as for the individual to feel better about themselves, and also to say, I don't have to do that behavior anymore. If that behavior really does compromise my values in some way, then there is something that I can do simply by not using to stop me from doing those behaviors that were causing me a problem. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. So it's important that you continue to study. I think all therapists need to continue to study about the effects of alcohol on the body and to promote that idea. I know that in 12-step programs it's not talked about too much, meaning the physical reality of the effect of drugs and alcohol, or the fact that it is a disease in that respect, and that we say and do things that we wouldn't normally say or do if we were clean and sober. And so I think it's an important part to remember and to continue to go back to for the individual in early recovery. More often than that, it is imperative that a man's brain be cleaned before he is approached, and that he then has a better chance of understanding and accepting what we have to offer. So here the caution is, you can certainly help some people in early detox, certainly give them information, but also remember that they will in fact be more receptive to that information the further away they are from the last drink. So be clear, or to help them, I think would be the initial word to say, to help them get off the drug, whether it be through traditional medical detox or through acuDetox, using acupuncture, some strategy to help get the body clean, and then as that occurs, then assist them to learn about the program. In Dr. Silkworth's lesson that he, or letter that he wrote for AA, says they believed in themselves, and still more in a power which pulls chronic alcoholics back from the gates of death. So Silkworth is talking about spirituality, which is certainly a founding principle of 12-step programs, is the spiritual principle. And even from the 30s, from a medical perspective, the doctor is stating that he saw little or no lasting effect of recovery until spirituality was somehow involved in the alcoholic's life. He says, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. So it's a separating of the alcoholic out from the normal drinkers. So it's not just the relationship, it's not just the sedative drug alcohol, it's the body's relationship to the sedative drug alcohol that we need to contend ourselves with in addiction recovery. And also, I think the reason for spiritual principles to be involved in the recovery process. So again, way back in the 30s, they're lining this out as necessary components in recovery. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideas must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives, to make new, to change, to alter their lives. So spirituality, again, even from a medical perspective, is very important in the change process. Silkworth goes on to say that all these and many others have one symptom in common. They cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon, as we have suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity. It has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. So before the book starts, the doctor in medicine is still saying that abstinence, again, an extreme behavior, but addiction is an extreme behavior. So in order to recover, the first thing to do is to eradicate, to get rid of the drug out of the body, and then to keep it out of the body. And so there's certainly statements in the program that getting sober is one thing, but staying sober is the other. And I certainly think that's the value of fellowship. That's the value of the steps. That's the value of the principles that we'll talk about from this point forward. As we move into chapter 1, into Bill's story, it's a very interesting story. It goes through many different ideas or experiences in Bill's life when he had some early spiritual experiences when he was in the military and did in fact see God in some very, very major ways in his life and helped him to some degree connect early on, but they weren't sufficient at that time in order for him to recover. Later on in his story, on his last drunk, when he's there and Ebby, his friend, comes and talks to him, is when Bill experiences his spiritual experience that really is laid out in the text very, very dramatically, that everything that he experienced in a matter of hours was really a play out of the entire 12-step program, from honesty, integrity, sharing with somebody else the nature of his wrongs, reaching out to God in spirit. And as a result of reaching out to God in spirit, becoming willing to release or to let go of self-limiting ideas, beliefs, and behaviors, making right the wrongs in his life, continuing to clear up problems when they showed up, continuing to pray, meditate, communicate with God or Spirit, and for sure, by all means, always being there to help another alcoholic. I don't know of any other treatment plan out there that includes that idea of fellowship. I think everything else that I said up to this point can be found in a variety of other treatment strategies that are all equally as good and effective. But the idea of fellowship really seems to be unique to AA, where it's one helping another, and that they even make statements in the organization that you can't keep it unless you give it away. So it's taught early on from the very first lesson when Bill met Dr. Bob before they even wrote the book, that it was simply Bill who was having a lot of trouble at the hotel with staying sober, but through talking with his wife and the 12-step work he had done before, he made a decision to make a call and to reach out, and he did find someone he could go talk to, Dr. Bob, and that's how they connected. When they connected, that's what started the whole movement. One alcoholic who wasn't feeling very good about his sobriety reached out to another alcoholic, and in that process something occurred, and the program was birthed from that. So it's a very powerful beginning. Bill, when he's talking to Ebby also, and Ebby is attempting to explain to him how what he has is more spirituality-based rather than religious-based, Bill's having a lot of trouble understanding God or Spirit. And as Ebby says, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And this was like a brand new idea for Bill Wilson. No one had ever given him the knowledge that it was all right for him to choose his own experience or his own relationship with God or Spirit. In his past experiences with religion, and religion does tend to tell us what we are to believe. That's the very nature of that idea that keeps religion together. Religion is saying our ideas, whatever the religion happens to be, are good, valuable ideas, and you need to believe a certain way in order for you to buy into our ideas. Spirituality, on the other hand, is kind of like what Bill says here, or what Ebby said to Bill, write your own concept. We don't care what you believe. We certainly believe that it's important that you believe, but we're not going to tell you how to believe. And so, from that perspective, the alcoholic or the addict is then invited into creating some new belief, which goes back into what the doctor said earlier on, is the alcoholic will recreate their lives. And so here, when it comes to recreation, they're going to recreate a relationship with God or Spirit that's going to work for them. It is only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than yourself. Nothing more was required to take me beyond this particular beginning. So just have willingness is really the ingredient here for anyone that's looking to develop a relationship with God or Spirit. Are you simply willing to attempt to learn to let that power come into your life, to be open to that idea or concept? From a therapeutic standpoint, I think it can be very helpful for the counselor or the staff to support the patients in a hospital or in an outpatient program to become willing and to be open to that, regardless of what the spiritual or religious beliefs of the counselor happens to be. But make it very obvious to the client that they are at choice about how they will believe. And then to design therapy strategies around that from a spiritual standpoint to help the client find ways to get past their blocks or barriers to belief so they can in fact find something to hold on to. And remember, and if you're in the field, you know that addiction is pretty devastating. And so to come out of that devastation by having a belief in Spirit at some level that does in fact work effectively is going to be of major interest and concern to the client. And we want relief. I think that that's really the key that we're looking for here. I also have, and this is personal, but I also have a belief that says that if there is spirituality involved and the individual holds on to that spirituality, then that can be their strength through difficult times in life. Because I maintain that 12 steps don't promise you a better life. They do promise you better skills and better tools to live your life. Because who knows what kind of life you're going to have. I mean, you could have death, divorce, separation, marriage, children, children leaving at home. Maybe children don't leave home. All these kinds of things could occur and can be a problem. Maybe you get a job or don't get a promotion. Things go well in a relationship or don't go well in a relationship. So sobriety doesn't mean that you're going to be X'd out of life. It just means that you're going to be in the flow of life, and life will bring to you whatever life brings to you. And in sobriety, the whole lesson, as far as I'm concerned, is learning how to deal with life on life terms. Again, a statement from the program, early wisdom of the program, is that we want to learn and have the skills to deal with life on life terms. And that's, again, what the program is offering people. On page 13 in Bill's story, it says, "Then I humbly offered myself to God, as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself utterly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing. Without him, I was lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have a newfound friend take them away, root and branch. I have not had a drink since. So Bill is making, again, some pretty powerful statements here, that as soon as he was willing to allow God or Spirit into his life, and up until this point, God was not much of a palatable idea for Bill, and he turned his life over to God or Spirit, that his life did get better, and he found friendship, he found freedom, and he also found a way to successfully stay off of the sedative drug alcohol. And we know from his experience for the rest of his life. But this is how it started, is that as soon as he found faith that he was willing to live by, then his life began to work more effectively. In Chapter 2, there's a solution. It says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous know thousands of men and women who were once just as hopeless as Bill. Nearly all have recovered. They have solved the drink problem. Again, this is some pretty powerful language. They have solved it. It's over. It's done. Thousands have recovered. Again, it started with 2 people, and by the time the 4th edition was written, they at least indicate maybe 2 million people are in the organization in 150 different countries throughout the world. So again, some pretty powerful recovery information has happened as a result of 2 men talking to each other, developing some kind of a spiritual belief, and going forward from there, which certainly makes sense that they would make these very strong statements. They have solved the drinking problem. So recovery, not cure, recovery has occurred. The problem is solved. It's not an issue anymore. And if the drinking problem isn't an issue, then the individual is free to work on more current or more or other issues in their life, family, relationships, job, work, goals, things that they want to establish and maintain for themselves. Other areas or other addictive disorders they might want to get behind them. So they're free to look at other issues once this has happened. We are people who normally didn't mix, but there exists among us a fellowship, a friendship, and an understanding which is incredibly wonderful. We are like passengers of a great liner. The moment after rescue of a shipwreck, from the camaraderie, the joyousness, and the democracy, they prevail on the ship. That there's a connection to people, not only from the common problem, but more importantly from the common solution. And so that's really the nature of the book. Isn't so much to talk about the problem, although when we get to the 12th step and sharing our experience with other people, it does talk about very specifically sharing your experience. It could be nitty-gritty experience. Maybe that's what the new person needs to hear, is exactly what the nitty-gritty was for somebody. Maybe they might need to hear just in a general way. Maybe having that specific knowledge is important to some people. Maybe general knowledge is important to other people. And that's certainly a value of going to the meetings for people in the program. Particularly early on in the program, they can learn to identify with other people. And maybe if they can't identify with the events that have occurred, maybe the identification will come more from the emotions, like when sadness or hurt or pain or anger or rage or resentment showed up. This is what I did, and then whatever the behavior happened to have been to medicate those particular emotions. And maybe the one that's looking in or hearing that will hear, oh yeah, I've been angry, I've been resentful, and that'll be how they begin to connect. Because I think the idea of connection is extremely important in the recovery process as well. There's an old picture, it's called Man in the Glass, Man in the Bottle, and the bottle is tipped to the side, and there's this man trying to escape out of the side. And that certainly depicts alcoholism or addiction as far as I'm concerned, because in the bottle they're insulated from the rest of the world. They don't have to really connect. I know that through working with family members, and it also talks about into the family in the big book, that a huge problem in addiction families is that the body of the alcoholic might be there, but the energy or the mind or the connection to the alcoholic doesn't exist. The spouse and the children have really lost their parent or their spouse to the addiction. because that is what is the primary relationship. And the body might still be around the house, might still be doing things, but there's no connection. The feeling of having shared is a common peril, in a common peril is one element of the powerful cement that binds us together. But that in itself would never have held us together as we are now joined. The tremendous fact for each one of us is that we have discovered a common solution. Now, and I've heard this idea, and certainly in AA it talks about it, you have to be one to help one. But the field of mental health has really expanded a lot over the years, and I think with the therapeutic skill called self-disclosure. I don't care who the therapist is, they've probably had some life experience that was problematic to them at one time. They did something internally, either did or didn't use God or Spirit, did or didn't use some other therapeutic technique. They did something in order to get over it, if in fact they're over it. So anyone can use that skill called self-disclosure, which is what AA is based on, self-disclosure, to help the addict out. So if you're not a recovering person and you're attempting to go through the book here and see how your experience can help somebody else, you can certainly talk about how your anger might have gotten you in trouble, and then you did certain things in order to get rid of the anger, the resentment, and now you don't have it anymore. Or let's say fear ran your life, and you did something in order to get over the fear. You changed your relationship with fear so it didn't run you anymore. Let's say you did something that you felt ashamed of, and you handled it, you resolved it in some way. Now you can share that with the alcoholic or the addict. So even if you're not in recovery, you have plenty of things to share, and use the skill self-disclosure if in fact you think it's going to be advantageous for the addict or the alcoholic. So self-disclosure is really the key therapeutic technique that the big book is based on, or the program is based on. But you certainly don't have to be one to help them. That's just how it happened to work in the beginning of AA. We have concluded to publish an anonymous volume setting forth the problem as we see it. We shall bring to task our combined experience and knowledge. This should suggest a useful program for anyone concerned with a drinking problem. So here it doesn't even say that it has to be exclusive. It says right here is a text, therapeutic process that can be used to help the problem drinker. And if in fact we use these particular skills and find ways to use them, then people will in fact recover. At least that's our experience. And so as we continue to go through the book, I want you to keep that together as a foundation for how this entire process happened, how it began, and certainly how it keeps going on to this day. Doubtless you are curious to discover how and why, in the face of expert opinion to the contrary, we have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. If you are an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you may already be asking, what do I have to do? It is the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. And again, this is the second reference to that idea. It talked earlier on that this book is written specifically to show people how we have recovered. Here again it states in the first 20 pages, this is how we did it. If you want answers, read the book. So it's very directive in its process. So even from a therapist standpoint, and the therapist is working with someone who's unsure about how to get clean and then stay clean or sober, to make very direct statements. If they want to use this reference here, they can certainly make references to here. It says at least 2 million people have done it this way. Do you want to be one of those 2 million or not? And can present that to the client. Again, therapists or people in the program are never responsible for the individual that wants to change, to make them change, but we are responsible to carry the message. There's a statement I heard somewhere in AA. It says, our job is to carry the message, not to carry the drunk. So that's what this is all about. If somebody is attempting to pass this information on, that's all you're doing. You're passing the information on. It could be your experience. It could be the experience of somebody else that you would be sharing with the addict or the alcoholic. And that's the end of really the responsibility. It's up to the addict or the alcoholic to take that information that was shared and to decide how they'll use it. That's really up to them. It says, therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than the body. If you ask him why he started on his last bender, chances are he will offer you any one of a number of alibis. Sometimes these excuses have a certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in the light of the havoc of the alcoholic's drinking. They sound like the philosophy of a man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so he can't feel the headache. So this mental twist about the alcoholic not being able to know why they drank is simply about them going unconscious. And in what I've certainly found in working with people, as I probe the idea of what caused that to occur, I've always found some emotion: anger, hurt, pain, sorrow, confusion, not caring, not believing it'll work. All those things were going on that then made it okay for the individual to go and use again. And so by working with that, and even Terry Gorski in a lot of his relapse prevention work talks about identifying the things that happened long before the drink occurred. And if you can identify those triggers that occurred in the addict's or the alcoholic's life, and then help them find ways to live past, to go beyond the trigger, then you can find strategies to help heal from those triggers, so that when the trigger occurs again, there can be a different response other than drinking or drugging. And the whole idea of alcohol being so powerful can begin to go away once we learn recovery strategies to help the alcoholic take the strain or the power away from the drug. And we're not talking about taking the power away from the drug once the drug is in the system. We're talking about not making that choice once an individual moves down some kind of a path or a pathway to go back and use. Intervention can occur many times before that drinking actually occurs. It says on page 25, there is a solution. Almost none of us like the self-searching and the leveling of our pride, the confession of shortcomings, which the process requires for its successful culmination. But we saw that it really worked in others. We had come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we had been living it. When therefore we were approached by those in whom the problem had been solved, those with nothing left for us but to pick up a simple kit of spiritual tools that were laid at our feet, we found much heaven, and we have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence by which we have never dreamed. So here again, in the first 25 pages, only 5 pages later, they're talking about a solution. They're talking about a major shift in behavior, and then in turn, psychological terms, major shifts are occurring that take the individual miles away from where they were before, nowhere near when they started. Simply by working with some very simple spiritual truths, and as far as I'm concerned, the first step, which is the admission of powerlessness and an unmanageable life, is basically telling the truth about one's relationship with the drug and the lifestyle, but without judging self in the process. The great fact is just this, nothing less, that we have deep and effective spiritual experiences which have revolutionized our whole attitude toward life through our fellowship and through God's universe. The central fact of our lives today is the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered into our hearts and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. We have commenced to accomplish these things for us, which we could never have done by ourselves. So, spiritual principles are certainly a major key here. As I was been studying the history of AA, I also found out that Sermon on the Mount has been a text that was certainly a major text early on in the program of recovery, looking for different spiritual principles to base the organization on. When they were moving away from the worship from the Oxford program, which was very religious in nature, they wanted to find something more spiritual in nature, and I think that's where they found those ideas in the Sermon on the Mount. And then allowed them to make statements like this, that we have had deep and effective spiritual experiences. And his little asterisk by spiritual experiences there, it says that spiritual experience to us means that we had some kind of a behavioral change that was sufficient to bring about our recovery. So right here it's limited specifically to being a behavior, an experience that allows the alcoholic to no longer use, or the drug addict to no longer use drugs. Now what we know also is that there have been 250 that I know of, different types of 12-step programs that have been created. We've got Sex Addicts Anonymous, Co-Sex Addicts Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Spenders, Overeaters, Incest Survivors, Compulsive Gambling, Spending, Work Addiction, Exercise, Compulsive Overeaters, Emotions Anonymous, Mentally Ill Recovered Alcoholics, MIRA. So we have a variety of different types of 12-step programs, and they're all basically making the same statements. Excuse me. That if in fact spiritual experiences happen, then they do bring about an entire recovery, a life change recovery. So when you're working with people, if you don't have a spiritual practice in your life, certainly doesn't mean that you can't help alcoholics. It just means, or addicts of any kind, it just means you would ask them questions to help them develop it for themselves. And from a living beyond your own prejudice, if you're a therapist that is prejudiced against religion or spirituality, then simply remain open to what's going to work for the client, not what is good for you. And that's certainly a philosophy that I've tried to live by as a therapist over the years, is I don't want to ever limit my clients by my limitations. I want to help them explore what they think is going to be meaningful to them, and for me to help facilitate that. Because I know that I certainly don't know what's best for clients. I mean, I have my idea of what's best for a client, but I don't know for sure that that is the best thing for the client. I don't know that. I'm not God. I mean, sometimes my ego is, I'm God, but I'm not God. And so it helps me help other people, because I can, as I talk with them and trust is developed, they'll guide me into what works for them. And it's simply my job to help facilitate that they find that out for themselves. It says the distinguished American psychologist William James, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, indicated a multitude of ways in which men have discovered God. We have no desire to convince anyone that there is only one way by which faith can be acquired. If what we have learned and felt and seen means anything at all, it means that all of us, whatever our race, creed, or color, are the children of a living Creator with whom we may form a relationship upon simple and understanding terms as soon as we are willing and honest enough to try. Those having religious affiliations will find here nothing disturbing to these beliefs or ceremonies. There is no friction among us over such matters. So here again, it's inclusive. That's the value of spirituality. It's inclusive, not exclusive. And so it'll incorporate wherever the individual happens to be. So this is an important lesson, I believe, in working with the addict or the alcoholic, is helping them find inclusive ways to have the program work for them. It says that we learned in Chapter 3 more about alcoholism. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic, that this is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. So again, very strong language in this text about the necessity that the addict or the alcoholic, addict of whatever kind, really smash the idea that they can ever regain control of their lives as it relates to using their particular addiction. Now, it's interesting that when we get into process addictions, meaning sex, gambling, spending, eating disorders, or those things that people are going to ongoingly do, that people are going to spend, they're going to have sex, they're going to be in relationships, they're going to eat, they're going to go to work, they're going to continue to do those activities. So we have some differences here between alcohol and drugs, which abstinence is the key, and the other things is where we will use these behaviors on a regular basis, and so abstinence isn't the key. So we have to kind of watch how we say here, how we learn this one. I'll read it again. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics, that this is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. So when it comes to the process addictions, it's continuing to recognize that we have tendencies, or the individual would have tendencies that they have to watch out for and watch their motives for using food, gambling, spending, money, sex, relationships. What are the motives behind them when they engage in those activities? I certainly know that every time I eat food is not because my body is hungry. There are many other reasons that I eat food other than my body is hungry. So for the one that's food addicted, they have to be very focused on their motive for the food, because to them, food is the drug. Same with sex. Not every time you have sex is for the experience of an exchange or for pleasure or joy or procreation. Maybe it's medication. So again, paying attention to the motive is what is important here. Not every relationship that you might ever have is for the purpose of sharing and connection. Maybe it's to medicate. I certainly know a lot of people that get divorced only to get into a relationship, and 2 or 3 days later they're married again or on the way to the racetrack again. And so what's the motive that drives it? So there we're not talking about abstinence, we're talking about the reason that drives them into the other behavior. But it's based on this idea here. The addict, once they cross that line, is not normal in their relationship to that particular addictive behavior. To be gravely affected, one does not necessarily have to drink a long time or take quantities some of us have. This is particularly true of women. Potential female alcoholics often turn into the real thing and are gone beyond recall in a few years. Certain drinkers who would be greatly insulted if called alcoholics are astonished at their inability to stop. So the value here of this particular statement is it kind of raises the bottom, and so it's not a geographical thing that you don't have to lose a car, a wife, a family, a husband, a body parts, a health in order to become a quote-unquote real alcoholic. You simply have to take a look at the relationship that you have to the chemical and the kinds of pains and discomfort that it's caused you. That's it, pure and simple. And if the pain is too great, then take steps to move away from the pain. If the pain is not too great, then you're probably not going to be motivated to look for some other solution for yourself. So again, it's important to pay attention to these things as you go down. Now, from a intervention standpoint, just because the individual, let's say, isn't all the way down the ladder, whatever that happens to be for them, doesn't mean they have to be. Maybe with an intervention we can raise the bottom. And that's certainly talked about in the family afterwards and to the employer. But it's certainly talked about, I know, in interventions, things that are common now that weren't common back then when the big book was written. But we can help raise the bottom. But it's the idea that the graveness of the effect is going to be different for each individual. So it's important to not typify the alcoholic. There is no typical alcoholic. There is no drug addict. There's no typical prescription drug addict. They don't exist. The only thing that might be typical is that when they use, they say and do things they wouldn't normally say or do, or they can't safely predict their behavior after the first one. Definition that I use, that I like, Jaeger's definition of addiction, is one's absolute refusal to be in a relationship with self. Meaning that if I have a feeling, then I take a drug or do a behavior that stops me or alters how I feel. That would be the refusal to be in a relationship with self. And the addict and alcoholic do that all the time. They don't want to have their own relationship with self. But as you'll see from the steps, that's what all the steps are about, is to get the individual back into relationship with self and others, God, self, and others. So, excuse me. So as we learn more about alcoholism, as it talks about it in the book here, there's many different attempts to sober up and then go back to drinking. That's really what a lot of the chapter is about, is times when people have tried to stay sober, didn't stay sober. They made promises to themselves only to not be able to keep them. Other people threatened them, and that they still weren't able to maintain abstinence. So it continues to show stories of countless vain attempts is really what it's about. That to drive home the point that through self-knowledge alone, that doesn't work. Through making promises or just half-hearted promises don't work. It's driving home the point that we must be convinced in our innermost selves that we're like different people, that we can no longer safely control or predict our behavior. And so it's driving home the point that the mind and the body of the alcoholic or the addict are different, and that they don't have control anymore. By making that, or coming to terms with that reality, the addict or the alcoholic is then able to enter into the ground of the first step in surrender, so to speak. And as a result of their surrender, they're able then to move forward. In the fourth chapter to the We Agnostics, it says, to be doomed in alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. And here again, problems with the mind. You would think, well, most people would very willingly, hey, give up that lifestyle if I'm going to die. But the alcoholic has to think about it. The addict has to think about it. And that certainly shows the peculiar mental twist that goes on in the mind of the addict or the alcoholic, just that they have to think about some strategy of recovery. And so the idea of being doomed is certainly, I'm glad they used that word there, because from also what I've seen and experienced in the program and in my practice, is that if the addict doesn't change, then they will die. I've had 15 people die at this place that I go to this year. 15 people in a month and a half, all from alcoholism. And these were a variety of ages, from the 30s to the 60s. And a friend of mine that I used to go to school with died, 50 years old, drank himself to death. And so it's just incredible what happens with this disease. It's tremendously predictable. I don't think that it's cunning, baffling, and powerful like the book says. I think it's cold, calculated, and scientific. If you don't stop drinking, bad things will occur. It's pretty scientific. If you do stop drinking, good things will occur. Pretty scientific. And the key is around stopping drinking. So how do you do that? That would again speak to the nature of spirituality. But also we're stuck with some kind of a dilemma, as it's stated in the idea that to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on spiritual principles is not always an easy alternative to face. And again, it says again, this is the third time, about lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Obviously, but where and how can we find that power? Once again, well, that's exactly what this book is about. That's the third time it references that statement, answering that very specific question. So now we're on page 45. That's what it says. So 3 times in the teens, the 20s, and the 40s of pages, excuse me, it makes that statement. That's exactly what this book about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problems. Again, pretty strong language. Spirituality, spiritual principles will solve your problems. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. And so, if the person is new and having struggles with God, spirituality invites us, as the book and the program invites us, into helping the alcoholic or the addict find some way to begin to believe that something might work for them that they haven't investigated yet. And again, in spirituality, we're not talking about telling the addict or the alcoholic what they have to believe. That would be more of a religious perspective where they have defined what God is. Here, it's helping the individual find for themselves what that spiritual principle might be. Certainly can help the addict or the alcoholic go back into their own lives and just show them by asking them a question. Take a look at your own ability to produce a result called abstinence. What's occurred? And then have them tell you their story, just like you did in the other chapter about countless vain attempts. Have them retell that story over and over and over again. That's the reality of their lives. That can certainly help them become open to the possibility of maybe being willing to believe that something else is necessary in order to help them or could help them. And just staying open to that is really all we're trying for here. Willingness, just a small amount of willingness is all that's necessary. And it certainly could simply be that the group, that the principles in the program are a power greater than themselves. And that term, power greater than themselves, could certainly be used instead of the term God, which is definitive of a particular name. Maybe it's just simply Great Spirit. Maybe it's divine intelligence. Any of those terms will work just fine. So we want to help the addict or the alcoholic find a term that they're willing to call that power by. Even if what they're willing to do is to discuss their struggles with spirit is a great idea. I refer to, when people are having troubles with God, to the movie Forrest Gump. And when, I think his name is Sergeant Dan, is after he's on Forrest Gump's shrimp boat, and they're out in some storm, and he's strapped himself to the mast of the ship, and he's cursing God just with power and passion throughout the night of the storm. And the next morning, the ship's okay, Sergeant Dan's okay, he feels at peace, the sun's out, and he dives off his perch up there and swims around and just feels great. He's been released. He has finally found some kind of a faith in spirit. And I certainly know many people in the program that have had those kinds of deliveries, let's say, from their own struggle or from their own idea of separation. So I might refer them to that particular movie, and then we'll talk more about spirituality after they've seen it. But I'll tell them about that patch or that piece of the movie and have them watch out for that. So as they talk again about agnostics, they talk about people that came in, didn't like God or didn't believe in God, only to have found a way through that dilemma of not being willing to accept God in their lives. We ask ourselves this: are not some of us just as biased and unreasonable about the realm of spirit as we were about the ancients, as were the ancients about the realm of the material? Even in the present century, American newspapers were afraid to print an account of the Wright brothers' first successful flight at Kitty Hawk. Had not all efforts to flight been denied before? And did not Professor Langley's flying machine go to the bottom of the Potomac River? So anytime peoples are presented with brand new ideas, there can be resistance to accepting those new ideas. So if you're in the clinical profession and or even if you're a person in recovery and you're presenting these ideas of spirituality to the new recovered addict or alcoholic, there's going to be resistance. That's okay. Let the resistance be there. Go on about your business and simply help them find ways to resolve that within themselves. It says here on page 55, we finally saw that faith in some kind of a power or God was a part of our makeup just as much as the feelings we have for a friend. And again, it says before that most people, it's ingrained within them some kind of an idea of some kind of a power source, whatever that might be. And that's certainly been a part of mankind. Certain things might have happened in their childhood that distorted their relationship with God. I know that I certainly had some struggles with God earlier on in my life. And as I began opening up to the ideas in the 12-step program about God, that's what helped me get over some of those old, I call them childhood ideas, that were certainly young in nature and certainly never really fully explored in childhood. I just blocked God out. And as I began willing to take a look at these principles, then God became more of a mainstay in my own life. It says, even so, has God restored all of us to our right minds, to a man the resolution was sudden. Some of us grew into it more slowly, but he has come to all of us who have honestly sought him. When we draw near to him, he discloses himself to us. So this idea, this one sentence, is pretty incredible, I think. That for the individual who is looking to be on a path, and again, the driver is pain coming out of addiction, to be on some kind of a path, meaning sober, that are you willing, or are you willing to believe that a power could in fact help you? This would be what it's saying here, to draw near him. He discloses himself to us. So with that, then we're on their way. And in this case, we've talked about the first two steps. In chapter 5, how it works, and then it gets into the steps, the start of the steps here. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. So here again, it's another statement. These principles will work whether you're singly diagnosed or dually diagnosed. Whether you're in MIRA, which is mentally ill recovering alcoholics, or straight AA, or if you have mental disease or not, you can do it if there's some ability to be honest. And again, for recovery from addiction, the honesty that's talked about here is your relationship to the chemical. What happens to you when you ingest the chemical? And if you can tell the truth about that and live that truth, then you can recover. That's in essence what the whole book is saying. In chapter 5:59, it goes on and talks about the steps. And like I said, I won't be talking about the steps here in any great depth. I'll go through them and just give you my rendition of them. This isn't the depth of the step discussion that you'll have. Again, that's more in the course on 12 Steps a Way Out, or 12 Steps of 12 Traditions. First one is we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, and I'll now put in the words drugs, sex, gambling, spending, work, food, emotions. Any of those would fit in here, and that our lives had become unmanageable. So it's the admission, it's telling the truth, it's acknowledging that I don't have any power over this particular substance or behavior, and that when I engage in that substance or behavior, my life becomes unmanageable. With that acceptance there and the admission of powerlessness, that opens up the possibility of the second step, which is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So that means something else will occur. If I don't have any power, I've got to go look for a power. So they have the second step, so you can begin to go look for a power, coming to believe that this power source will in fact restore you to sane, rational thinking. And initially, it's as it relates to that lifestyle, sane, rational thinking as it relates to that lifestyle. So that's being restored to sanity, which is also, I think, continuing to tell the truth about one's relationship to that lifestyle. The third step is made a decision. So it's the alcoholic's mind. Remember, the problem of the alcoholic is in the mind, not the body. Well, the mind is being restored when it says made a decision. That's a mental process, a decision to turn one's will and life over to the care of God as you understand God. So now there is a reliance that's already been set up, as I say it, that in the second step you're just kind of testing out God to see if God really works, or higher power to see if it really works. And in the third step, you're pretty convinced, because you're going to make a decision to give over your life and to this power's care, which means that trust has been established with that power source. There's also statements in the book that says that if the third step has little or no lasting value unless immediately followed by a thorough fourth step, the fourth step is made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So this is where you're going to go back and tell the truth about your relationship with self. You're going to do it, though, not unaided. You're going to do it aided by the power that you got from your higher power. So you're going to go back and be able to identify people, places, things, events in your life that you have resentments against, fear about, bad relationships, shame or bad sexual relationships. You're going to take a look at all those issues, and you're going to identify the person, place, thing, or event. You're going to identify what occurred, what effect it had on you, and then the part you played. So the inventory isn't about them, meaning people outside of you or institutions outside of you. It's about you. How are you involved in your own life? So instead of pointing at other people, all the fingers are coming back to you and you're looking at yourself. As a result of this inventory, and kind of the check and balance to become really aware of what are the nature of the wrongs, the fifth step is admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of one's wrongs. So you're going to take a look at the nature of the wrong, what actually occurred. And to me, the inventory sharing in the fifth step isn't so much the things that were done. People might have issues with the things that were done, and that's certainly fine to clear those out. But I think what we're looking for in the fifth step, for the exact nature of the wrong, how did fear run me? How did low self-esteem? How did anger or resentment run the individual? And that would be the exact nature of the wrong. Those are things, those character defects are things that can be resolved, and they're probably still with you to some degree when you take the inventory. And so in order to be free from addiction, it's important to find ways to let that go, and that would then be where the sixth step comes in. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. So it's a further reliance versus defiance on God, that God is in fact going to be called upon to remove these defects of character, meaning it's up to the individual to define them for themselves, but it's up to God or Spirit to take them away. Seventh step, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. Now, shortcomings and defects of character are really saying the same thing. Joe and Charlie's tape explained that. They knew Bill, and they're speakers for AA or NAA, and they make that distinction that shortcomings and character defects are really the same thing. So don't get hung up in the terms there. Bill just didn't want to use the same word twice. So we're going to ask God with humility, not with head held down, but with humility, God to remove these defects of character. And I certainly agree with what the program says, that they don't all go away all at once. They go away over time, but it gives us a step or a tool to continue to create resolution from these defects of character. The eighth step about healing in relationships. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. So by making the list, you basically go back to the fourth step, take all the people you identified, put them in the eight-step list, and again, check your willingness to make amends to these people or these institutions. Do you really want to let them go? Do you really want to release these people? Do you really want to make amends to them? And if in fact it comes true, and you do in fact, and you're willing to do that, then you make the ninth step, which is make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So then we go back to the people that we have harmed, and we make the amend. And it's not simply saying I'm sorry in word, it's changing action, becoming a different person, and then transferring that message to them that I am a different person now. But being very sure, and the wisdom here is that we're very sure not to do this at the expense of somebody else. So it's not okay in the program to get better at somebody else's expense. So just because you feel bad about it doesn't mean that it's your right to go share that with someone who you hurt, because that might be very hurtful to them. So it's important with all these steps to share what you do and when you do these things with sponsor or with therapist or somebody else that you're working with. At least that's the initial suggestion in the organization. You know, you don't have to do this alone. You alone have to do the work, but you don't have to do it alone. And so check it out with other people. Step 10, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. So it's a statement of the idea that you're going to continue to have life problems, and when you have life problems, there is something you can do about it, which is make the amends, which is not do it again, which is pray, meditate, a variety of things that have already been established in the principles before the steps here. The 11th step, sought through prayer and meditation. So we're going to talk to God or Spirit. If you're going to have a good relationship with anybody, it's important that you talk to them, prayer, and it's also important that you listen to them, meditation. So through prayer and meditation is exactly how I'm going to communicate with God or Spirit. So I can, in fact, improve my conscious contact with God as I understand God at any given time. And I'm going to pray only for knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry that out. So again, it's very specific about how to communicate with God or Spirit, and very specific about how to work with God or Spirit in order for us to continue to live life. Pray for openness so that we be guided throughout the day what our next step is to be, and then having the power to carry that out in the process. The 12th step is having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. And we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So, because of the work that has been done, the honesty, which is really all that's happened in the 12 steps, is they told the truth. That's it. As a result of that, I get a personality change, a spiritual awakening, a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery. And then we're going to carry this message, of the addict and alcoholic will carry the message to other people that are still suffering, that there is a way out. It does in fact occur, and I've experienced that, and these are my experiences. And we're going to practice the principles of honesty, integrity, truth-telling, spirituality in all affairs. So it's going to become a living part of life. It's not something that's done in a meeting, it's something that's done in life, and then meetings simply become a part of life. And so as we look at the steps, there's a way out of life problems. There's a way out of the dilemma that alcoholism has caused throughout life. As you go through the book, there's a whole chapter that's been written specifically towards working with other people. So from either a sponsorship standpoint or from a therapist standpoint that wants to use self-disclosure, this has got great information about how to do that. It says here on 103, after all, our problems were of our own making. Bottles were only a symbol. Besides, we have stopped fighting anyone or everything. We have to. So it's a mandate. We have to stop. We get over that. It's just a symptom. If we deal with the other underlying issues, then life works. And I've heard people in the program say, I don't know how the program works. Well, it's pretty simple how it works. It's based on honesty. It's based on telling the truth. It's based on being honest with other people. It's based on spirituality. It's based on doing some hard work with self to stop the blaming of self and others and simply accept this is what occurred and then changing behavior. In Chapter 8 to the wives, it talks about pretty extensively the effect that alcohol has had on the family. It focuses specifically on husband and wife and very little on children, but it certainly does talk about that. And it talks about working with the wife of the alcoholic in order to help the wife understand the disease of addiction, that it has nothing to do with what she did or didn't do. The alcoholic had the disease irrespective of what kind of relationship they have with the family. It's also addressing some of the real shame and anger and remorse the wife might be feeling in the process. There's really nothing you could have done about it. It makes statements in here that many spouses might get upset that a group of strangers, meaning all these AA people, could do something for the alcoholic that the wife couldn't do, and that might cause some struggles in that marriage relationship. But also the Al-Anon perspective brings in there the reality that it's not your job to help the alcoholic get or to stay clean and sober. It's out of your realm, and so it kind of creates a boundary there for the spouse. It says, when you have successfully explained to such people that he is a sick person, you will have created a new atmosphere. Barriers which have sprung up between you and your friends will disappear with the growth of a sympathetic understanding. You will no longer be self-conscious and feel that you must apologize as though your husband were a weak character. He may be anything but that. his new courage, good nature, and a lack of self-consciousness will do wonders for you and for society. So it helps the family to get rid of their anger and feelings of self-loathing and embarrassment by normalizing the disease and explaining that the alcoholic isn't weak. They simply have a disease in the process. And as it goes through the chapter, it talks about what the family can do in order to continue to maintain their sense of worthiness, whether the alcoholic stays sober or not. That they have their own life, and that's totally separate from the alcoholic, and that they can live whether the alcoholic gets sober or not. Yet there are things they can do to help support the alcoholic to maintain sobriety. In the family afterwards, it continues to go into more information about the alcoholic and about the family and the impact that alcohol has had on family. It also talks in the family afterward about health. A body badly burned by alcohol does not often recover or overnight, nor do twisted thinking and depression vanish in a twinkle. We are convinced that a spiritual mode of living is a most powerful health restorer. We who have recovered from serious drinking are miracles of mental health, but we have seen remarkable transformations in our bodies. Hardly one of our crowd now shows any mark or dissipation. So by becoming healthy, proper diet, nutrition, moving into healthy foods. At the time, they didn't know much about sugars and flours, but now stay away from sugars and flours. They're not going to help in the process. So by having a healthy body, healthy diet, exercise, these things will help. Also on 134, it talks about a word about sexual relationships. Alcohol is so sexually stimulating to some men that they have overindulged. Couples are occasionally dismayed to find that when drinking is stopped, the man tends to be impotent. Unless the reason is understood, there may be emotional upset. Some of us had this experience only to enjoy in a few months a finer intimacy than ever. So it talks about talking to your physician, talking to a psychologist, talking to your minister, going outside of the realm of the program in order to get health and wellness. Again, health, talk to a dietitian, a nutritionist. These would be great resources that certainly go right along with the principles of the program. Finding a good counselor will certainly be to your advantage, and it's certainly referenced to here in the text. It's interesting, I've heard sometimes referred to the program when people do read self-help books or go to a therapist and they're drinking, they make statements that those things don't work. Well, what it says very different in the book, it says, of course those things don't work. Nothing works when you're using. After you quit using, everything works. You're not any different than anybody else on the planet. And so these other strategies can have wonderful, far-reaching effects. In the chapter to the employer, it talks about helping the employee go back to work, and this might be certainly the start of EAPs, Employee Assistance Programs, where there's a assistance at work. There's kindness and understanding for the alcoholic in the work environment so that they can integrate back into the work environment in a kind, loving way. And the employer certainly has a reason, if you will, to allow the alcoholic to come back in, because experience has certainly proved out time and time again that the employee is now much better because the employer was there for them. They didn't throw them to the side. They did support them. And even if the alcoholic lost their job and now they're sober, they're going to work better for the people that they are working for, because now work and life has meaning, and they're certainly going to be better off in the process. In A Vision for You, chapter 11, it says, never could we recapture the great moments of the past. There was an insistent yearning to enjoy life that we once did, and a heartbreaking obsession that some new miracle of control would enable us to do it. There were always one more attempt and one more failure. The less people tolerated us, the more we withdrew from society, from life itself. As we became subjects of King Alcohol, this loneliness never settled down. It thickened. It became even blacker. Some of us sought sordid places, hoping to find understanding, some companionship and approval. Momentarily we did, then we became further in oblivion, and the awful awkwardness of facing the hideous four horsemen: terror, bewilderment, frustration, despair. Unhappy drinkers who read this page will understand. So in A Vision for You, it talks one more time, even after we've gone through employer, through family, through the steps, that these ideas may still show up. By continuing to work the program, by continuing to go to meetings, by staying involved, by helping other people, they'll find a way out. It says, we have shown how we got from under. You said, yes, I am willing, but am I consigned to be in a life where I'm stupid, boring, and glum, like some righteous people I see? I know I must get along without liquor, but how can I? Have you a sufficient substitute? Right there, that question right there needs to be answered to the positive, I believe. Because the alcoholic, even though they've left, or they're leaving, or the addict is leaving a pretty devastating lifestyle, they're looking for some kind of a statement, if you will, that will life get any better? I mean, anybody that changes anything wants some kind of an assurance that what they're going to do differently is better than what they're giving up. It says, yes, there is a sufficient substitute, and it is vastly more than that. It is a fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. There you will find release from care, boredom, and worry. Your imagination will be fired. Life will mean something at last. The most satisfactory years of your existence lie ahead. Thus we find the fellowship, and so will you. So what it's saying here, again, at the very last of the book, last chapter in the book, that life will get better, that there is good things that will occur now that you are, in fact, clean and sober, now that you have moved away from drugs and alcohol. It says the very practical approach to his problems, the absence of intolerance of any kind, the informality, the genuine democracy, the uncanny understanding which these people had was incredible. He and his wife would leave elated by a thought of what they could now do for some stricken acquaintance and his family. So families come together, the addict or alcoholic comes together because they can take the problems and see how they can benefit other people. From a trauma resolution standpoint, when the individual that has been traumatized sees how their trauma can be beneficial as part of the recovery step in trauma, we'll see how our experience can benefit others. So this also helps reassure the addict or the alcoholic that their life wasn't for nothing, that there was not for nothing, that there was something, that there was some benefit to it. Still, you might say, but I have not had the benefit of contact with you who wrote this book. We cannot be sure. God will determine that. So you must remember that your own reliance is always upon Him. He will show you how to create the fellowship that you crave. So even though Bill and Bob are dead and the people that created the organization aren't here, we have the book, we have the text. Certainly the first 164 pages, which is basically the text of the big book, although for your test, there's many other stories in here, and you'll read those as well as you go through. It's the text and the strategies that talk about how to recover, the use of religion, the use of priests, the use of psychiatry, the use of counselors. AA doesn't have a corner on the market, is how it's stated in the book. It says we simply found something that works for us. And that's really my message at the end of this tape, is impart this message to your clients in your treatment programs, Get them through the steps as fast as you can. That was certainly part of what was established in the initial days of AA, is people were taking through the steps very quickly. That doesn't mean they can't do them slower later on, but get them through quickly, get them through the process of truth-telling so their life can go on and they can work effectively. The idea that they can drink again must be smashed. One person helping another is how the program works. Bring God or Spirit into life, and life then happens for people. I thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been an interesting lesson for you. And again, you'll continue to read the stories in the back of the book, and you'll learn a lot more information about addiction and recovery as you go through those. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.